懂内容有认识。例子呢강을
So now we are in verse number 4, and it begins with, when I see beings with a bad nature, overwhelmed by their heavy misdeeds or suffering, may I care for them as if I had discovered a jewel treasure, for they are so hard to find. So those beings with a bad nature, they always suffer, they are always miserable. And also in the 37 Bodhisattva practices, it says that all of this unbearable suffering of the lower realms comes from negative deeds, misdeeds, negativities. So that is what we need to understand here. What is a negativity or what is a misdeed? It comes from this grasping to a self, and due to that we develop emotions of anger and jealousy and greediness and so on, and then we accumulate karma with these emotions. And then as a result, these become the cause of falling into the lower realms. For example, greed then leads to birth as a hungry spirit, or anger leads to birth in hell, and ignorance leads to birth as an animal, and jealousy leads to birth in the jealous God realm. So we see a lot of suffering in this world, greater suffering, lesser suffering, and all of that comes from these misdeeds, these negativities in the mind. And on the other hand, there are some places in the world where the people are much more happy and things go well. They have good relations to other countries, they trade and so forth, and it's almost like different countries are like a family. And then there is others who are constantly at war and fight. And all of these difficulties that the individuals then experience of this constant warfare and impoverishment and lack of good relations and so forth, all of these difficulties and conflicts come from the karma that we have accumulated in previous lives. And then having accumulated this karma, some ripen in a very significant way, like in these war zones, and then some ripen in a more subtle way. For example, an animal, there might be a very small animal, but if that animal brings some level of love with it, then it will be born as a beautiful animal that people like, that has a beautiful voice, or their appearance is pleasant and people like to feed them or give them honey and so on, and invite them to their homes and have them as pets and so on. And then there is other animals that people have to kill. For example, like very subtle little creatures like bugs and so on, that we often have to give poison, and then they're killed. So what kind of karma is all of that? And what kind of suffering do they experience? So when you see all of that suffering, compassion should arise within your mind. And compassion only arises if you first cultivate a mind of love, of care for them. Then compassion arises. If you don't really care, if you don't really love them, the true compassion will also not arise. For example, you might see some fish being killed and just dying, but that might not affect you in a very particular way. You might just see the fish as something inanimate, like a rock or some earth. It doesn't really generate a feeling in you. But then a person who really cares and who loves and has compassion, when they see such suffering, then the feeling that comes to them is actually unbearable. And that is a sign of love, that there is love in their heart. And some people actually just have that naturally. A person who truly has great care and love for others, when they see that there is someone who suffers, then naturally they would develop compassion. And that is a boundless, unconditioned kind of compassion that arises. And when that arises, you are actually purifying really incalculable obscurations and negative karmas. And bodhicitta begins to develop in your mind. So when you see such suffering beings, here in the verse it says, it is like finding a jewel treasure. And that, for this reason, this verse actually is also related to the practice of patience. If you have patience, you feel that no matter how much others hurt you or harm you, you will endure that with patience. And then the negative circumstance actually becomes a cause of merit. For example, if somebody triggers your anger, actually you need someone to trigger your anger, because otherwise you can't recognize it. It is said, if there is no object that makes me, no object of anger, then whom shall I practice patience with? And if there is no object of desire, then who shall I practice ethical discipline with? So all of these circumstances can become a cause of cultivating bodhicitta in this way. So if you know that, then you can be skillful as in to transform all circumstances into a cause of accumulating merit. And that will lead to the benefit of others, the happiness of others, and your own greatest benefit as your own bodhicitta further and further increases. So for this reason, it is very important to clearly understand this. So here when we say that it is like discovering a jewel treasure that is so hard to find. So to understand that correctly, now for example, if there is a person who sees somebody else who experiences suffering, be it a person or an animal and so on. So then if you see that somebody suffers, then you would want, if you have compassion, you would want to do something to help them. For example, if they are sick, then you would help them get medical treatment, or if they're cold, you give them clothing, or if they're hungry, you offer them food. And however, at that time, what happens in your mind is that you think, I have helped out that person. I have done something good. So there is this sense of I have done something. But actually, whatever you do for the other person is considerably small, because we cannot really help someone in a vast way by giving them food. In that moment, of course, their belly is full and they're not hungry, and that benefits them. But what is much more vast than that is that as a result, you have increased your own love and compassion, and it becomes a cause for increasing bodhicitta. And that is the only cause for attaining birth in the higher realms in all future lifetimes. And that is the cause for attaining enlightenment ultimately. So at that time, you should think that through having been able to help that person, I have gained more love and compassion. That is really inconceivable. So this is how the Buddhas have seen it, that actually it is not that you are kind to the suffering person, but actually the suffering person is kind to you, because through you having an opportunity to help them out, you have gained love, which is very much more significant actually. And then when it is directed towards higher beings, it becomes faith and devotion. And when faith arises again, that is your own greatest benefit. And that is why it is always good to not examine those beings, like teachers and so on, too much, but to have a pure perception, thinking that they all are Sangha. Actually, all the followers of any religion in the world, they all are Sangha. And if you see it in this vast way, it is like you are planting many seeds in a field that will bear a lot of crops. So if your faith is vast and your compassion for sentient beings is vast, that is actually your own greatest benefit. So if you understand it in this way, then your understanding of this line here then is unmistaken. So what we need to understand here when we say discovering a jewel treasure which is hard to find is that actually you helping the suffering person is actually your own greatest benefit. There is still one important thing to be said about this here, discovering a jewel treasure which is hard to find. And so that is now when you encounter someone who suffers, then it's also important that you reflect upon the cause of that person's suffering. There are some individuals who have obtained a precious human body, but still they encounter all kinds of difficulties. Some do not have any money, they are very poor, and some are lonely, they do not find companions, friends, and some experience a lot of illness and pain, and they have no one to help them, and so on. So there's a lot of suffering like that. Many people experience suffering like that. And what is the cause of that suffering? So you have found the precious human body as a result of some slight virtue, some love that you have accumulated. For example, it is said if you only observe a single vow, then you have actually created the cause for being born as a human being. But then still, what happens in our mind? There still are many afflictive emotions in our mind. And so for this reason, we experience ongoing suffering. For example, there's one affliction that is extremely difficult to recognize because it is very subtle, very hard to recognize. But it arises when you see someone that you don't particularly like experiencing some misfortune or suffering, or when somebody is doing a little better and so on. So that is the affliction of jealousy, and it is very difficult to see it, but it is the very cause of destroying all of our merit. It destroys all of our causes of happiness. So what is jealousy? What is the essence of jealousy? For example, we are jealous when someone who is better than us comes along. And that happens, for example, between Dharma friends or between friends and companions. We are jealous at each other. And the essence of jealousy is that the feeling of jealousy is you rejoice in the misfortune, the suffering of others that you don't like. So, for example, then you feel that, oh yes, he should be sick, or he should have some pain, or he should have this difficulty, he deserves it, and so on. And so you think that they are deserving of their misfortune. And even though you don't say a single word, if you secretly rejoice in their misfortune and think that that's right, they deserve that, then it is said whatever you rejoice in, that is exactly what will come to you, what will ripen upon you. So therefore it is very important to recognize jealousy. And if you recognize it, wisdom, awareness increases. So recognize each of the afflictions that arises. So when you look at your mind, what you find? we speak about jealousy, but then if you look at your own mind, am I actually also thinking in these ways? For example, yes, he deserves it and so on. Actually, honestly, we do. We think in these ways. And if we do, then we can be 100% certain that in the future we will experience corresponding suffering. So therefore, it's so important to recognize jealousy. And when you recognize the affliction, then primordial wisdom will reveal itself. Milarepa had said, aside from recognizing the the falsehood of the afflictions, there is no other primordial wisdom than that. So that is primordial wisdom. That's a sign of true wisdom. True wisdom is not the various abilities of our ordinary consciousness that projects outward, but it is the awareness that understands the fault in the afflictive emotions and the quality of bodhicitta. So that's the supreme wisdom to develop. And so for that, it is very important that we clearly recognize our own afflictions. So then verse number 5, that has to do with some jealousy. So it says, may I accept any loss from such unfair treatment as being attacked and belittled by those who are jealous of me, and may I give every gain to others. So that is very clear, and this verse of the 37 practices is related to verse number 14, where it says, even if others slander you throughout 1 billion worlds, in return speak with a loving mind of their good qualities. This is the way of a bodhisattva. Even if others would criticize you or slander you, or you're attacked or belittled by others, without retaliating, one should think that this is perhaps a fault that I have. So you should look at your own mind and see, do I have this fault I'm accused of? And actually, it is said that being belittled by others and put down and downgraded and so on actually is a great benefit, because Padre Rinpoche and Dr. Padre Rinpoche had said, I do not like to be praised. I prefer to be blamed, because when I'm praised, pride increases. And that is something we have to be very careful about, especially when it comes to praise. It is very easy for us to develop pride when we are being praised. So when someone praises your good qualities, then you should still look at your mind and see, do I really actually have all those qualities? We should always analyze our mind. And if we find that I have these wonderful qualities, then there is a danger that we develop a pride in that. So when others blame you and put you down, then actually that is something we want. We want that criticism, because then that gives us something for the future to be careful about. So this is a point, if someone blames you for a certain thing, then this is a point where I have to be more careful in the future. So actually we consider being belittled and slandered as a very important part for our practice, because that happens all the time and actually could be a positive thing. For example, there is some, even lamas, even teachers who criticize each other, but then actually often this criticism is the very thing that then turns away the obstacle to a long life. So it is that hindrance that purifies the obstacle to a long life, which then in the end turns out to be a good thing. So actually you can say that such slander and criticism actually becomes the best long life puja that you can do. And however, most people don't slander anyways. They have a lot of devotion, but it is possible to happen. And so basically, when we should, as you mentioned before, we should take the blame and not look at our own qualities. And that is on the receiving end. And now when it goes the other way, however, we have to be very careful, because it is said that slandering or attacking or belittling someone who is a bodhisattva is one of the greatest downfalls, and that's something to be very careful about. So aside from that, there is nothing to be concerned about. So next is verse number 6. It says, "May I view one whom I have greatly hoped would help me, but instead mistreats or even harms me, as my greatest spiritual teacher." And that corresponds to verse number 16 in the 37 practices, where it says, "Even if someone you have cared for as dearly as your own child regards you as an enemy, love that person even more as a mother would her ailing child. This is the way of a bodhisattva." So this has to do with if you're helping someone and caring for someone, and in response they hurt you and harm you. And first of all, this is due to karma accumulated in previous lives, which is now ripening, and it is related to a more pronounced form of ignorance. And so then a person, even though you care for them dearly, regards you as an enemy. And so for that person, we should care for that person, as it says here, with even more love, like a mother would for her sick child. And understand the person is afflicted, and ignorance backs up all of their other afflictions. So for them, we have to cultivate even more love and compassion. And only if you really love that person, real compassion will arise. And if your love and care is not so strong, then true compassion also cannot arise. In the Drikung lineage, we have a special quality of, first and foremost, we cultivate love, compassion for the enemy, those who hate me, those who obstruct me and harm me, and so on. These are our first and foremost objects of compassion. And those are normally the individuals who trigger a very powerful, intense emotion in us. We are so angry at them, we cannot bear it. And if you are able to cultivate love for them, then you really have cultivated love for all. So it's very important to be able to cultivate love and compassion for such a person that you consider an enemy. And the next is verse number 7. It says, "In brief, may I offer directly and indirectly help and happiness to all mother beings, and may I secretly take upon myself all their harm and suffering." So this directly and indirectly offering help, it relates to the actual direct connections relations that we have in this world when we act with body and speech and so on. And so at that time, in any circumstance, whether it's directly or indirectly, this is a prayer: may I give love and happiness, the causes of happiness and benefit to others. May I benefit others in all my actions whenever I can. And so secretly take upon myself their harm and suffering. What is the cause of all sentient beings' suffering? It is self-grasping and the afflictive emotions. So this verse here actually mainly speaks about the practice of Tonglen, where you give away your own happiness and you take on the suffering of others. And then secretly take upon myself. That means that you recognize that the afflictive emotions of all sentient beings and my own afflictive emotions are not any different. They're one and the same. So at a time when you encounter affliction, when emotions arise, or when you are sick, or when you suffer, and suffering arises, then you should think, this suffering is the suffering of all sentient beings. It is one and the same. And by experiencing that suffering, may I take on the suffering of all other beings. May I be their representative, experiencing it instead of them. And in that way, your own experience of suffering will actually get lesser and lesser. And also, through understanding the view, you understand that if you purify an afflictive emotion in your own mind, then because your mind is one with the mind of all beings, the afflictive emotions of all sentient beings in the 3 realms of samsara has been reduced by you purifying your own afflictive emotion. So if you know that, rest in the natural state of the mind and in an instant recognize that single basis, the ultimate truth. So whenever suffering arises or when an afflictive emotion arises, in an instant bring to mind all sentient beings and think that I experience this instead of them. And know that in this way you are reducing the general collective suffering of sentient beings to some extent. And secretly also has to do with cultivating a mind of love and care for sentient beings. So what this is saying is, may all sentient beings give rise to a mind of love. So this is a practice of Donglen here. So when you're doing well, then make a prayer. At a moment of love, make a prayer, may all beings have this love. And at the time when you experience affliction and suffering and pain, then take it onto yourself and think that I will experience this pain for the sake of all sentient beings. So this is how we should visualize here. And then there is the last verse, number 8, when it says, may all of this be untainted by stains of the 8 worldly attitudes, and may the wisdom that knows all existing things to be illusory bring freedom from the bonds of attachment. The 8 worldly attitudes is that this life, in this life, being alive here, various things manifest. And we believe in the true existence of these appearances. Basically, we believe self and other truly exist. And for as long as we believe that, whatever we do, whether it is Dharma activity or mundane activities, whatever we do will become tainted by the 8 worldly attitudes or affairs. Because seeing things this way, whatever we do it for this life. And so then it says, the wisdom that knows all existing things to be illusory. Now, actually, the true nature of things is that there are no self and other. They are not separate. Samsara and nirvana are non-dual. That is the true nature of things, the true nature of mind. And whatever appears like an illusion. The 6 realms of samsara are an illusory appearance. They are the natural reflection or the projection of one's own afflictions, for example, hatred. So temporarily, the 6 afflictive emotions lead to self-projections which manifest as the 6 realms, just like rainbows in the sky. And they will continue to appear until the causes for their appearance have come to an end. But meanwhile, Buddha nature always remains as it is, unchangingly and without coming and going. So from the perspective of the ultimate truth, all sentient beings on the basis are actually Buddhas, and therefore they can become liberated. So this verse here corresponds precisely to verse number 22 in the 37 practices, where it says, the way things appear is your own mind. Mind itself primordially transcends fabricated extremes. Knowing just this, do not create concepts of subject and object. This is the way of a bodhisattva. So this verse speaks about the ultimate truth, and it is actually very clear, and it's saying that first you have to gain certainty in that all appearances are your own mind, and then you gain certainty that that mind itself is emptiness. So as we learned during the empowerment also yesterday, when you realize that self and other do not actually exist separately, you realize non-dual primordial wisdom. And that is, as it says here, what will bring freedom from the bonds of existence or attachment. So this concludes the instructions on the 8 verses. Even though we don't have so much time, but there's this point here is important, and is secretly taking upon oneself here. It carries a lot of meaning here, and that is also now that we all are sangha, and a sangha is the one who can be aware of the suffering of all sentient beings when no one else can. And what the sangha then sees is that the suffering, the root of all suffering, is the grasping at a self. And therefore the sangha cultivates a mind of immeasurable love for all beings. And in that way, their love, their mind becomes pervasive. The greater the love, the more the mind pervades. In the King of Aspiration Prayer for Excellent Conduct, it says, love is that power that pervades all, that is all pervasive. And so that is what the Sangha state of mind. At least they think that may everyone in this world be well and happy. So that is the altruistic mind that melts the self-grasping, just like the sun is melting the frost in the morning. So the more love arises, the more self-grasping is melting. So the actual root of suffering is that, this clinging, grasping at as self. And that is secret because no one has seen it.